outline, and then they gave us absolutely no instruction as to what that meant, right? And for most of you, for most of us, thinking about the law is a different way of thinking than it is thinking about, in my case, I was a history major, thinking about a history course, or even an engineering course or biology course. And so it's useful to think about your strategy. So I went to the director of academic support, Angela Lecklider, and said that I'd like to do an outlining seminar. And there's a second reason, and it's that I miss being in the classroom, so this is my way to get in front of students for 45 minutes. True confession. And so the second part of this will involve doing sample exams as well. In my first tenure track job, a legal teaching job, I taught at a very low-ranked school. I actually loved that job. But one year we faced terrible, like bottom-of-the-barrel bar results, and we were very afraid that we might not continue to exist. So faculty were asked to volunteer to get, this was in California, which is a very tough law school market. Faculty were asked to volunteer if they wanted to participate in bar mentoring, and so I did that for a couple of years. We significantly raised our ranking. I still had a job. I'm here today. Because if we had gone out of business, I wouldn't surely be the dean of law school, I can promise you. But I worked very closely and spent a lot of time working with the bar questions. And bar questions tend to be similar state to state. There's some state variation, but the basic model is very similar. And in the course of that, I developed a strategy for attacking exam questions. And I would encourage you to think about coming to that as well, because I can't tell you how many students I've had, students who are not even my own, who would come and see me, say, hey, I heard you have this whole technique for answering bar questions, because I didn't do this in my last two jobs at Georgia State and Tulane, respectively. But I would share this with students sometimes, and they would say, why don't they teach us this in the first year? I said, well, it's not like it's a universal knowledge, but it will serve you very well no matter the subject, I'd suggest. I'd really encourage you to come to that quest, but I'm giving you a few weeks to get into the semester and see how things go. Okay. Dimitri, you're not shy, so I'll call on you. If you were my students, you do have your mouth full, but I cold call, but I'm not going to cold call on you if I don't know you, so you don't have to get nervous. But tell me, what course are you enjoying right now? I hope you're enjoying at least one.
I like torts.
Okay, you like torts.
All of
Good.
them.
I understand a little of torts. I taught it a long time ago, but so what's the issue you're studying right now? Give me a case name.
Vaughn versus Menlove.
Okay, Vaughn versus Menlove.
Yeah, Menlove.
What's it about?
It was about setting a reasonably prudent person standard in negligence.
Okay, so you're trying to look at what is reasonable, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's a reasonable person? Okay, so do you remember by any chance the year or the approximate year?
Ooh.
Approximate, I'm not
it had to have been a while back. I think it was like
1907 or like 19.
It was like 1894.
Sorry?
Like 1894 or
So
something.
it's an old case.
Somebody check me.
So, one thing as you go, and this was the mistake I made, I think, but my message here is there is no one right way to outline, but you have to be organizing around what is most important. What's most important? Is the case name the most important thing?
No, sir.
What's the most important thing?
The rule and how to
The
apply it.
rule and how to apply it, right? And even before the rule, so you could organize chronologically, right? And by that I mean chronologically according to the case syllabus, according to how the issues develop. And so, for example, Dimitri would put Vaughn versus Menlove 1894, and then even before you say the rule, you're going to say, so this is where your legal writing courses are very useful for you here. Ultimately, it's all integrated. What comes before the rule?
Holding?
Well, the holding announces the rule.
The issue?
The issue, right? So you have to know, so this is going to be very, very important. So issue, what comes next? You've heard about this in lawyering skills already. Analysis, remind me, I know we met. What's your name?
My name's Taylor.
Taylor, right. So analysis, course, if this is a memo, it would be conclusion. You don't need, for purposes of an outline, to have a conclusion. But these three things, no matter how you organize, are going to be the most important. And I'd suggest that for outlining purposes, the issues are the things you want to focus on, right? Now, the other thing is here, I would encourage you, how many of you have started 4 torts, true confessions, right? No judgment here. How many 4 torts have already started to do your outline? No, let me see hands high. I want to know. I want to get, those aren't high. I can't see who's who. Okay. Those people are all 3 steps ahead of everybody else. And all of you, torts is on Tuesday, Thursday, right?
Mm-hmm.
Correct? All of you, after tomorrow's class, should start your outline. Or maybe even tonight, you start your outline for torts. You will be much better off if you start to outline now in every single course, because it's a way of digesting your ideas. What you should do is set aside, if I were you, I would set aside a half an hour for every course as soon as possible after the course that day. And try not, just schedule it, write out a schedule. So torts is on Tuesday and Thursday, later that day, even before you do your reading for the next day. Why? Because it forces you to process that information. The more you start to repeat these things, the more you start to identify issue, rule, and any questions about it, which is what falls into analysis, because analysis is going to be why, the justification, any dissents, questions, right? Because this is where you can end up shining on your exam answer. But first, you always need to know what the issue is, so that ultimately this is going to help you on your exams. Why? Because a mistake that a lot of first-year students make in writing their first semester exams, especially students who, like me, have been history students or political science or English, someplace you use words, is that they end up writing a very descriptive essay, right? But lawyers are looking to know what's the issue. When you're working in your first legal job, one of the most common questions will be, I'll say, this case, this woman, was hit by a car, she's walked in, she wants to know what we can do, and I will say to him, my associate, what's the issue here, right? So he may say, was the driver negligent? He may say, is there strict liability in this context? See, that's the first question. So you always have to be asking yourself about the cases what the issue is, right? And then to identify the rule. So this is what my suggestion, again, I'm telling you what works for Colin Crawford. This may not work for you. You have to figure out how to organize yourself. But first and foremost, set time aside every day, right after class, as soon as possible, to digest this information. I promise you, if you are doing this regularly and treat it like a job where you have to get this done that day, you will be much better in every one of your classes at the end of the term, because you'll think, wow, I really understood how that stuff grew. So especially this is important for those of you who have not been in the working world, where you constantly have to give assignments, but have more recently come from undergraduate life. A law school exam, keep in mind, for most of your classes you have one exam. It is not like your undergraduate experience where you're being cumulatively graded. So you have to be working with yourself, and your outline is the tool to do this, to make sure that you are getting the cumulative benefit and understanding what you don't understand. So what is my suggestion? My suggestion, this is what I find generally results in greater exam success, which is the point at the end of the day of the outline, right? The better option is to, so here, this is by chronologically, by which I mean according to the syllabus, and option 2 would be by issue. Now, there may be a rough correspondence here, right, between these two things. But it may be, if you do it by issue, you will find that, in part, for example, torts is a good example. What is a reasonable person is a question that runs throughout the Anglo-American law of torts, determining that reasonable issue. But later, When you get, for example, to strict liability, reasonableness relates primarily to negligence. So later, you may be readjusting these issues depending on their importance. So, for example, right now, you're on August 28th, today 28th? 27th. On August 27th, the first issue in the outline might be, what is a reasonable person? And what you want to do then is not get just the holding. And this is why you're outlining. Outlining should be a process of synthesis, not just of repeating what you get in the cases, right? It's not just about Vaughn versus whatever, Menlo, whatever it is, 1894 in the Circuit Court of Kansas, right? Those details ultimately are not important unless your professor tells you that you need to know case names and locations. That's not what lawyers are looking for if the law is good. So this becomes the issue. And then the rule might be, so it might be that there's a majority rule. And that is what you are trying to extract. Rather than the holding in a particular case, you're trying to extract from these cases, right? So you may have 2 or 3 cases talking about what is reasonable. And they start to change over time, right? And so you write then, and this is the point of the outlining, so it becomes an analytical exercise for you. You look down and you read this Vaughn case, but is that the only case you read? Unreasonableness? I imagine not. So then you look at those cases and say, what's in common in these cases, right? Maybe there is also then a minority position. And again, it's not always going to be the same, but these templates will generally help you. So you state the majority rule, right? A reasonable person is one who, under similar circumstances, would react in a way that does not shock the conscience or something like that, right? So you get in the process, you get in the habit of stating a rule about that issue. Then you start to plug in the cases, right? So then it may be you get the majority rule, the minority rule, and then you might have a category, like questions, right, that this raises. You might have a category like, and again, this changes, like dissents, right, from that position. Or challenges, something like that, right? Some other category. The point is you are finding for you what works as a way to understand first and foremost, here is the issue and here is the rule. Issue, rule. Issue, rule. And then how you defend or argue against it. So another thing you might do, you might have issue, rule, and then you say pro. This is another way to organize it, right? Or con. So issue, rule, in favor, arguments in favor of the rule, arguments against the rule. You can stick in the case names as little reminders to yourself. So you have in a parenthesis, pro. Vaughn versus Menlo, lady hit by a car when grain elevator blown over by hurricane. Whatever the facts are, right? Just to remember that so that you can make an analogy to that if you want. And some of your professors will ask you to remember case names. You just have to prepare for that and adapt to it. But once again, what I'm trying to tell you is everyone, in my view, should be focusing on getting those for every single thing and then come up with a way of breaking down that information that focuses on the relevant analysis of that issue and rule, right? So the cases just become facts in support of one or other position, right? But you have extracted the most important thing. Because when it comes to writing your exams, what's going to be valued is the person who begins something like, the issue here is whether Dimitri hit Taylor in a situation that was unprovoked, and therefore Taylor's hitting him back was reasonable or not, right? And then the next sentence would be, the applicable rule of reasonableness provides. So you're always doing this two-step issue and rule, right? But that's what you should be using your outlining time to do. It's not just repeating. I remember my first outline in law school, I would just list all the cases, right? This case held this case held this case held this. It needs to be a more active, integrative way of working with the cases to identify what they have in common and where there is a different position, right? So as you will see as you go along, reasonableness can start to change. For example, when you have abnormally dangerous activities, when you have chemically toxic substances, for example, that can start to change. Now, what will also change, I suggest to you, it may be that at the beginning, reasonableness is very important, but then reasonableness ends up being a justification for other rules. So it may be then, because you're doing this all the time and you're actively engaging with all this material, you rearrange it as you go along. So maybe on September 27th, all of a sudden the outline begins with negligence. I'm not saying this is the case, right? I'm not teaching you torts. Different people teach it differently, but most torts courses are going to look at negligence, strict liability, and other categories of basic torts, right? So it may be then that negligence with its four-part test, duty, breach, causation, damages, ends up becoming more important, and reasonableness is a part of that. But you will only discover that if, once again, I can't repeat this enough, you are making this regular outlining in an integrative, analytical way, a way of engaging the material and thinking it through. And I promise you, final exams will be much less stressful if you have engaged this material and really dedicated the time now to analyzing what are these cases. You take 3 cases with reasonableness standard, for example. Is there a rule you can extract from those 3? That should be the task, rather than just, as you must do for class, so beforehand you have to be prepared so that when Professor Abramson says, what's the issue in this case and what's the holding, you have to be able to do that. But at the end of the day, the holding itself is going to recede in importance, and the rule that comes from that holding is what's going to matter, right? So that was my very brief session on outlining, but I'll take questions now because some of you, in my experience, have I said everything I wanted to? See. Yes, what's your name? Remind me. I may forget, but I'll try and get these names eventually.
Phil.
Phil.
Would you say that one of those options may work better with different classes?
It's possible. What I would put that in 2 ways, Phil. So I think they can do better for different people and different classes. In my experience, and I'm talking about 20 years of working with students, writing exam questions, reviewing exam questions, and working with students intensively in bar prep. In my experience, in almost all cases, this is going to yield better results, right? Unless you were taking, for example, a legal history case course, right? Because the thing is, especially for where you all are right now, there are many ways to start a tort course. It doesn't necessarily have to start with reasonableness. But, so that's not necessarily the first thing that you're going to need to know at the end of the day, right? And that's why outlining gives the advantage of regularly reviewing. You say, oh, this is actually more important now. You realize that the first part on reasonableness was a building block to get you from A to L, right? So in general, my belief is, and you should test this, don't just take it because I'm telling you, but my belief is that if you're doing issue and rule, that will serve you very, very well. I mean, whether that's, you guys are also taking criminal law right now, right? Is property property start this term or next year?
That's
So
right.
you're taking property as well, taking contracts, right? So contracts, I imagine you started with consideration, yes? No? Yeah. I mean, most contracts, no, what do you start with? What's the first issue?
I just don't know like the consideration.
What was the first, what's your name?
Kelsey.
Kelsey. Oh, formation, okay, so contract formation, right. So that's a good example. I mean, formation is important to know what that means, right? But my guess is by the time you get to the exam, formation becomes important background knowledge rather than foreground knowledge. And that's why if you're doing the outline constantly and readjusting it, that's my message to you. Don't think that it's just a static thing that you're always adding to. Right? It's something you're always engaging with and rethinking and readjusting as you start to get the idea of the central principles in every area of the law, right? Because what's going to happen when they get to the exam? They're not going to ask you just to regurgitate, yes, this contract is properly formed, but they will try and create facts that challenge that. Right, so oral contracts, right? Did this exceed the statute of frauds? I mean, they will throw in things which you'll get to, believe me, that are designed to test the depth of your knowledge. But it's only really, once again, if you're starting to take these very, very simple steps from the beginning, and then as you start to get a sense of where the law is developing, how the areas that you're being asked to understand, that you'll really get a sense of that, right? Other questions? No one has any questions? Yes, remind me of your name.
Madeline. In our property law class, for example, Professor Rothstein gave us an outline. With professors who give us outlines that kind of require us engaging with their outline, would it be kind of, I don't know, would it kind of like lead us astray if we do our own outline?
I actually think it'll make your own outline better if you're working with and against hers. And I would say this to her, right? In other words, I don't think you should take the outline that you get from your professor as biblical, right? It's not something that you just slavishly observe, because only if you're engaging in that are you going to start to understand this. For example, where does property is my favorite course to teach, actually. What does she start with?
Right now we're at adverse possession.
Oh, adverse possession. See?
So... That's what the outline starts with.
No, okay, because those are the cases you're starting with first, right?
Kind of. Yeah.
Kind of, or
We
no?
had some other stuff, but adverse possession is like the first thing on the outline.
Adverse. Adverse possession. Which usually shocks the conscience of most law students, right? Which is why I know. That's actually why I don't start deliberately with adverse possession. You know, there are many ways to crack a nut. And that's personal choice, right? I start with the question of what is possession, right? Which is very much like Kelsey's what is formation in contract, right? What does it mean to possess, right? Do I possess this now? That's where I start. So she starts, I assume, with adverse possession to show this shifting notion of ownership, right? But it may be by the end of the term that you'll realize that, say, ownership is the issue and adverse possession is a subpart of that, right? But the point is, and again, and the reason I say, work with her outline, but also push against it. Organize things in a way that makes sense for you, but the task should be to think of the headings that matter, right? Rather than some sort of slavish adherence to the order in which you got these things, right? Because, I always say when I teach first-year classes, I have a double obligation, and the second obligation is much more important from my point of view than the first. The first obligation is to teach you percentage of X law, right? To make sure you understand enough about adverse possession and landlord-tenant law and mortgage law, whatever the topics are that your particular jurisdiction covers. That's part of your job. But the more important and second part of my job is to teach you how to think about that law. But you're only going to be able to think about it, and this goes back to your question. Is it Philip or Philip?
Yeah.
Which?
Oh, Phil.
Your question, Phil. The more important question always is that everything is beginning from being able to identify the relevant issue and then stating the rule. Because you may disagree with the rule. You may think it's badly reasoned. You may think in the particular case the rule should not apply for a particular reason. So you have to get into that habit of knowing the issue and the rule. And you're starting with the baby steps, exactly what Dimitri said, of saying issue and holding. But, you know, there are a gazillion holdings and many fewer rules, right? And so don't give too much credence to particular holdings. Start to try and look for continuities, and that's how the outlining process can really, really be helpful. The other thing I would say is, as you work with your outline, and this goes to Madeline's question also about working with an outline you've been given, right? That you want to get to a situation where you may have a very, very long outline, but by the day you're going into the exam, you've really tapered it down, right? I knew someone who is now quite a brilliant lawyer. When we were going into final exams, had the entire course on 1 3x5 card, because he had been working this through and came to understand it so well, so that by the exam he had just stripped it down to these principles, right? I'm not saying everyone has to do that, but it reflects the benefit of cumulative working through this. And again, you cannot assume, as you can in undergraduate, that in the study week you'll be able to catch up, because this is all cumulative. You'll do much better if you treat law school like a full-time job, not a 40-hour-a-week job, but a 50 to 60-hour-a-week job, where you're really putting in the time now. It will be time so much better spent by the end, bless you, and for your emotional, mental health in addition. Yes, what's your name?
Kaylin.
Caitlin or?
Kaylin.
Kaylin.
So this is probably going to be up to our professors and I guess just whatever they want to do, but thinking of these outlines as like living documents that we're going to be modifying as things become more important and less important, do you think it would be a good idea for us to talk to our professors, like say, you know, formation's important at the beginning, but then I think something else is more important, to take our outline to them and say, you know, I'm getting this theme from the course now, am I on the right track, or am I getting the right
I would
this?
absolutely, some of them may come to me and say, I had 80 students coming to my office because of you. But you, from my point of view, you absolutely should, right? You should go and say, how does this look?
Okay.
I will tell you that when students, especially first-year students, did that with me, the typical outline I would get would just start and just go step through everything they've read, right? But that doesn't achieve what you need to do, which is to be cultivating this thing we call, you know, thinking like a lawyer, right? That's what you're using the outline to do, it's a reiterative process of learning to think like a lawyer. And so that thinking is using that judgment. Now, the professor, I mean, I'm not trying to suggest, don't misunderstand, I'm not trying to suggest formation is unimportant or that possession is unimportant. But it may be that you'll start to understand that the real things that drive the law of torts, for example, drive the law of contracts, for example, are not questions of formation, not the technicalities of formation, but it may be that, it's been a long time since I've studied contracts, this is not a substantive comment. It may be that the expectations of the parties actually are more important, right? Or that in the law of torts you start to see, well, reasonableness is a question, it runs through all of the law of negligence, right? But it doesn't run through the law of strict liability, right? It doesn't, I'm going completely blank, what's the third big category?
Intentional torts.
The intentional torts, right? Or it doesn't fall, you know, battery is not a question in reasonableness, right? So, you know, it may be then that your tort outline ends up being intentional torts, negligence, strict liability. Those are the three big categories, and then you're fitting the three, that you're fitting the sub-themes into that, right? And I'm not putting those in order of importance. There are three different big areas of tort law you need to learn. So when I say things are receding in importance, I'm not saying they're unimportant, but they're not going to be the things that on the exam end up getting tested, probably. Other questions? So I hope this was relatively painless. You at least got fed, right? If you have any questions, I mean, I don't really like to comment on outlines for other people's courses, but if anyone ever wants to talk about, you know, they're having a challenge with something, in just thinking through the way you're organizing it, you know, it's best always go to your professor, but you can come and kick those ideas around with me as well. So, okay, and I think there's still a lot of pizza. I keep on telling them to order less food, but the message is not getting. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.